Back then, they say humanity spoke a single language. Gathered in one place, people decided to build a city and a tower so tall it would reach the heavens. According to the book of Genesis, this construction symbolized human arrogance before God. In response, God supposedly came down, confused their language, and scattered them across the earth. That's the famous story of the Tower of Babel. But did it really happen like that? What if this tower was in fact something very different from what we imagine? What if behind the myth there was a real structure, a tangible civilization, and even archaeological evidence buried deep in the heart of ancient Mesopotamia? Everyone has heard of the Tower of Babel, that colossal construction where humanity, once united by a single language, tried to reach the heavens and was punished with the confusion of tongues. But is this story just a religious myth, or is there some historical and archaeological basis behind it? What does it say about the origins of linguistic diversity in the world? And why, even after millennia, does this narrative still captivate cultures around the globe? In this video, we will explore the Tower of Babel as a symbol, as a possible historical reality, and as a central element in discussions about identity, power, and language. The classic image of the Tower of Babel that dominates the Western imagination is that of a gigantic, spiraling tower stretching upward into the clouds, a structure that defied the boundaries between heaven and earth. However, archaeological evidence points to a very different setting: Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the world's first organized civilizations emerged. In this region, monumental structures known as ziggurats were built as religious temples. Made of sun-dried or kiln-fired bricks and constructed in stepped levels, these buildings had wide bases and grew narrower as they ascended, creating the impression of a rise toward the sky. The most famous of these was the ziggurat of Etemenanki, dedicated to the god Marduk in Babylon, with a base around 91 meters wide and, according to some sources, possibly over 90 meters high. These constructions weren't exclusive to Babylon. Other notable examples were erected in cities like Eridu and Nippur, urban centers that flourished in Lower Mesopotamia during the Sumerian and Akkadian periods. The ziggurat of Eridu, for instance, is considered one of the oldest ever found, dating to around 2100 BCE and associated with the worship of the god Enki. In Nippur, the main temple was dedicated to Enlil, one of the most important gods in the Sumerian pantheon. The tiered architecture of these monuments was deeply connected to the Mesopotamian worldview, which saw the cosmos as a layered structure linking the divine and earthly realms. Thus, ziggurats served as bridges between gods and humans, not as literal challenges to the heavens, but as spiritual centers, elevating the city's sanctity. The phrase "reaching the heavens," mentioned in Genesis, was a common formula used in royal inscriptions at the time, generally in a symbolic sense. In cuneiform texts found on clay tablets, Mesopotamian kings often claimed their constructions touched the heavens, not to suggest limitless height, but to magnify their achievements before the gods. This exalted language had a propagandistic and religious function, reinforcing the ruler's prestige and the temple's centrality. Therefore, when the Bible states that the people sought to build a tower whose top would reach the heavens, the phrase may be a direct allusion to this style of writing prevalent in Mesopotamian culture. Modern archaeology identifies the Tower of Babel with the ziggurat of Etemenanki, located in the heart of ancient Babylon in present-day Iraq. Though in ruins, its base and references in historical records continue to be studied by scholars seeking to virtually reconstruct its original form. Ancient sources, such as the Greek historian Herodotus, mention a 7-story tower in Babylon,
suggesting that oral traditions about such a structure circulated widely in the ancient world. Even though Genesis doesn't provide a detailed description of a tower, cross-reference in Hebrew and Babylonian sources makes the link between the biblical text and this monumental structure plausible. Another factor reinforcing this association is the central role that ziggurats played in Mesopotamian city-states. These buildings weren't merely religious sites, but also organizing hubs for urban life. Cities expanded around them, and their construction required collective labor, specialized craftsmanship, and complex social coordination, all of which align with the biblical account of all people gathering to build one city and one tower. The Genesis narrative may therefore reflect an indirect, orally preserved memory of such structures and their function in ancient civilizations. At the same time, it's important to note that ziggurats weren't built to defy the gods, but to serve them. Contrary to the image of pride attributed to the Tower of Babel in the biblical account, ziggurats were devotional projects meant to honor and approach the divine. This difference in interpretation stems from the perspective of the narrator. In Hebrew tradition, Babel symbolizes confusion and rebellion. In Babylonian tradition, the ziggurat was the link between heaven and earth, a symbol of cosmic order. Thus, the Tower of Babel was not an extraordinary, isolated structure, but part of a well-established architectural practice in Mesopotamian culture. Reinterpreting the tower as a ziggurat allows us to view the biblical episode not as a literal account, but as a symbolic narrative inspired by real constructions known through observation or oral tradition. This leads us to explore the meanings behind the structure, themes of transgression, religious symbolism, and human ambition, which will be addressed in the next sections of the story.
The narrative of the Tower of Babel, as described in Genesis, goes beyond the physical construction of a tower. Its symbolic core lies in the human attempt to break through the boundaries set between the realms of humanity and divinity. In the ancient civilizations, especially within Mesopotamian culture, there was a clear distinction between the world of men and the world of gods, and crossing that line was seen as dangerous. By building a tower that would reach the heavens, humans were not merely erecting an imposing structure. They were, according to the biblical text, approaching a domain that didn't belong to them. The act symbolizes an invasion of the sacred, a recurrent theme in ancient Near Eastern mythology. This kind of narrative appears in other myths from Mesopotamian culture. A prime example is the epic of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, who sought immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu. Gilgamesh travels across the known world in search of the gods, attempting to attain something humans were not meant to have, eternal life. His quest ends with the denial of divine gifts and a return to his kingdom as a changed but still mortal man. Just like in the story of Babel, the attempt to surpass divine limits is met with failure, not as arbitrary punishment, but because such domains belong to an order that was not to be violated. This idea of sacred boundaries is a constant theme in Mesopotamian mythology. Another important example is the story of Adapa, a sage created by the god Ea, who stands as a liminal figure between humans and gods. At one point, Adapa is given the opportunity to gain immortality when summoned before Anu, the supreme deity. However, he refuses the food offered to him out of fear, thereby missing the chance to live forever. The myth of Adapa reinforces the concept that even when humans get close to the divine, there's always something that prevents full transition. The boundary between man and God remains. The same idea appears in the Babel narrative, where divine intervention halts human advancement by scattering the peoples and confusing their languages. In the creation myth found in the Bible, we encounter a similar pattern. In Eden,
Adam and Eve are forbidden from eating the fruit of the tree and knowledge of good and evil. When they disobey, they are expelled from paradise and condemned to a mortal life. The narrative structure mirrors that of Babel. A divine command is broken, and the result is separation between humanity and the divine. The Tower of Babel can be seen as another repetition of this motif, the attempt to ascend to heaven, interpreted as a breach of sacred order. This narrative pattern reveals a broader cultural concern with the limits of human power and the hierarchy between heavenly and earthly spheres. Another example is found in the episode of the Nephilim in Genesis chapter 6. There, celestial beings, sons of God, take human women as wives, producing a hybrid offspring. The result is the birth of giants and the spread of corruption on earth, leading to the divine decision to send the flood. Once again, the overflow between divine and human worlds is punished by separation and destruction. In all these narratives, Gilgamesh, Adapa, Adam and Eve, Nephilim, and the Tower of Babel, the common thread is the violation of metaphysical boundaries. The divine response, far from being gratuitous, functions as a mechanism to restore order. It's important to note that this concept of separation between divine and human wasn't exclusive to Hebrew tradition. Peoples of Mesopotamian culture shared the same worldview. For the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians, the cosmos was structured in layers, each with its own function and limits. Heaven belonged to the gods, earth to humans, and the underworld to the dead. Narratives exploring the transgression of these limits often ended in failure or punishment. Thus, the Tower of Babel story, though told from an Israelite perspective, directly dialogues with a much broader tradition spanning the entire ancient Near East. The tower's symbolism in this context represents more than an architectural structure. It becomes a vertical axis attempting to unite what, according to ancient cosmology, should remain separate. It's the human ambition to surpass the role assigned within creation. By touching the sky, even symbolically, humans challenge cosmic balance. The divine response, to confuse the languages and scatter the peoples, restores the natural fragmentation of the world, preventing a unified and powerful humanity from advancing towards what was not theirs. This is where the Tower of Babel earns its place among major creation myths, offering an explanation for the origin of linguistic diversity and the separation of nations. Therefore, understanding the relationship between the tower and the divine requires more than a literal reading of the story. It must be viewed within a symbolic universe, where every action carries deep meanings about the limits of human nature. The act of building a tower was not merely architectural, it was theological. And it's precisely this tension between human and divine that sets the stage for the next themes: arrogance, the city, and the attempt to make a name, elements that reinforce the symbolic backdrop of the narrative, and will be explored in the next section.
In the Genesis narrative, one of the central elements is the builder's declaration, "Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth." This phrase, often overlooked, carries deep significance within the biblical and ancient cultural context. The desire to make a name wasn't merely an expression of collective self-esteem, but a direct attempt to inscribe human presence into eternity through a constructed work. In this context, a name meant identity, glory, and permanence. By trying to establish their name through the city and the tower, the people were symbolically competing with the divine, seeking eternity through their own means, rather than through blessings or promises from the heavens. This type of behavior is tied to a concept deeply rooted in both Greek and Semitic traditions: hubris, the arrogance or pride that drives humans to surpass the limits of their condition. In the Greek world, hubris was considered one of the most serious offenses against the gods, usually punished by downfall and destruction. In the Semitic world, the idea was similar. Placing excessive confidence in human strength while ignoring divine boundaries was seen as a threat to order. The construction of the Tower of Babel fits into this symbolic pattern of overreach. The attempt to make a name was therefore a quest for a kind of power that transcended human limits, and form of immortality achieved without divine mediation. This connection between pride and downfall appears in other episodes within Genesis itself. The figure of Cain, for instance, also sought to leave his mark after the murder of Abel. Cast out and cursed, he built a city and named it after his son, a possible attempt to perpetuate his lineage, perhaps as symbolic reparation or a show of power. Later, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are depicted as centers of excess, independence, and arrogance. These cities represent, in the biblical narrative, the extreme of human self-sufficiency disconnected from divine guidance, and, like Babel, are marked by sudden and exemplary destruction. In ancient civilizations, the city was an ambiguous symbol. On one hand, it represented safety, culture, and organization. On the other, it was often associated with pride, centralized power, and the desire to control fate. In many traditions of the ancient Near East, including Mesopotamian culture, kings built cities with the explicit aim of making an eternal name, inscribing their achievements into stones, walls, and temples. This practice may have directly influenced the writing of the biblical text, as the desire to immortalize one's name through monumental works was common among the region's ruling mentality. Thus, the city and Tower of Babel emerge as architectural expressions of a human impulse for eternity and control. The theological and symbolic problem, then, lay not just in the tower, but also in the city. The Bible appears to condemn not only the construction itself, but what it represented: the unification of all humanity into a single center, under a single project, with a single goal, leaving no room for diversity, dispersion, or limits. The tower, in this sense, was merely the culmination of an attempt to control time and space. The desire to not be scattered implied resistance to the very command God had given Noah's descendants to multiply and spread across the earth. So the city tower project appears as a form of symbolic resistance to dispersion, a challenge to the divine plan for human expansion. At the same time, it's important to understand that the idea of name is also tied to power. In Semitic cultures, to name something or someone was an act of dominion. By naming, the individual asserted control over the named. When the people of Babel sought to make a name for themselves, they were also attempting to assert control over their own identity, autonomy, and destiny. Instead of relying on divine naming, as was the case with biblical patriarchs, they sought self-definition, a gesture interpreted as rebellion and spiritual independence. This narrative choice reinforces the clash between human centralization and divine sovereignty, a symbolic axis that runs throughout the Babel story. The mention of name also resonates with broader literary themes present in both Genesis and neighboring traditions. To make a name in the ancient world was to achieve immortality, whether through a city, a military feat, or a monumental work. The Tower of Babel in this context is the ultimate attempt to condense power, identity, and eternity into a single architectural gesture. The divine punishment that follows, the confusion of languages and scattering of peoples, appears as a way to break this project of uniformity. By halting construction and dispersing human groups, the narrative introduces plurality, fragmentation, and diversity as central aspects of the human experience, setting the stage for the next part, the rise of the city of Babel as a symbol of power, and the contrast between the Hebrew view and historical Babylon.
The city of Babel, as cited in Genesis, has long been interpreted as the place where the confusion of languages and the scattering of humanity occurred. However, the name Babel has much older origins and different meanings depending on the tradition. In the Akkadian language spoken in Mesopotamia, the word Bab Elim literally means gate of the gods. This name carried sacred and positive connotations, indicating that the city was seen as a point of connection between the earthly and the divine. In the Hebrew text, however, Babel is associated with the verb balal, meaning to confuse, establishing a wordplay that transforms the ancient Mesopotamian capital into a symbol of chaos and dispersion. This negative reinterpretation is not simply a mistranslation, but rather reflects an ideological stance within the biblical narrative. By linking Babel to confusion, the text seeks to emphasize the opposition between Hebrew identity and the Mesopotamian superpower. The city, which to the Babylonians represented cosmic order and religious centrality, is portrayed in the biblical story as the epicenter of human disobedience. This contrast reveals much about the political, cultural, and religious tensions among regional peoples. The historical Babylon, far from being a place of disorder, was a complex metropolis filled with temples, palaces, libraries, and sophisticated legal systems, serving as a political and spiritual hub across the Mesopotamian world. The Enuma Elish, one of the Babylonians' primary mythological texts, reinforces Babel's role as a sacred city. In this story, the god Marduk, after defeating the forces of chaos, is proclaimed leader of the gods and orders the construction of Babylon as the seat of his temple, the Esagila. According to the text, the gods themselves take part in the founding of the city, making it the center of an ordered universe. This version of the city's creation sharply contrasts with Genesis. Instead of being destroyed or abandoned, Babylon is the direct result of divine will, a space where sacred and political dimensions are intertwined. The tower associated with Babel, the ziggurat Etemenanki, was part of this religious complex, reinforcing the connection between heaven and earth, not between pride and punishment.
The founding of the city of Babylon was far more than a matter of geography or politics. It was understood in its own time as a sacred act established by the gods. This view is clearly recorded in the cosmogonic poem Enuma Elish, one of the most important texts in Babylonian tradition. In it, the creation of the city is not depicted as a result of human ambition, but as a divine initiative, planned and executed by the gods themselves after Marduk's victory over the forces of chaos. According to this account, Marduk is elevated to the head of the pantheon and decides to build a dwelling for the gods, a center of worship and cosmic balance. That dwelling becomes Babylon, the city that would unite heaven and earth through the Esagila temple. This religious perspective is essential to understand how the Babylonians viewed their city. It was not merely an imperial capital, but the point of convergence between the earthly and celestial worlds. In the Enuma Elish, Babylon is founded shortly after the creation of the world, suggesting that the city existed since the cosmos began, playing a central role in maintaining universal order. Upon ordering its construction, Marduk summons other gods to participate in the project, as if the city were a collective divine effort, not a human feat. The tower associated with this city, the Etemenanki ziggurat, would then be the physical expression of this sacred link, arising as a symbolic axis between different planes of existence. The Enuma Elish also describes how the gods honor Marduk for his creative power and how humans are created to serve him. This association between city, temple, and created deity reinforces the idea that Babylon was not a cultural accident, but a core element of Babylonian theology. The myth offered a legitimizing explanation for the city's power, architectural grandeur, and religious centrality. At the same time, it portrayed Marduk as a supreme god whose authority extended not only over other deities, but over all people and kings.
This positioned Babylon on a different level compared to other cities in Mesopotamia. Over the centuries, this narrative was absorbed into the real practices of Babylonian power. Kings like Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar II associated their reigns with Marduk's worship, renovating and expanding the city's structures as a way to reaffirm their connection to divine order. These works were documented in inscriptions that detailed not only the buildings erected, but also their religious and cosmic significance. Restoring temples, rebuilding ziggurats, and maintaining rituals was more than political duty. It was a spiritual responsibility with direct implications for the world's balance and the empire's protection. This fusion of history and myth, of architecture and theology, explains why Babylon became such a powerful symbol, both for its people and its neighbors. For the Babylonians, the city represented original harmony, the victory of order over chaos, the presence of gods among men. For outsiders, especially those conquered or exiled on the Babylonian rule, that same city could be viewed with suspicion or hostility. It's here that the narratives diverge. What for some was the ultimate expression of the sacred, for others was imperial arrogance and foreign domination. The city of Babel, as presented in the Bible, can be read as a symbolic response to this historical prestige. The story of the confusion of languages and human scattering may be interpreted as a critique at a mythic claim that Babylon was the legitimate center of the world. By portraying its unity as undone by divine intervention, the Hebrew text counters the Babylonian myth with a narrative of limitation and fragility. Thus, while Babylonians proclaimed their city as the will of the gods, the biblical authors reframed that same place as the mark of disorder caused by human ambition. This symbolic clash between such opposing views of the same city is one of the keys to understanding the power and persistence of the Tower of Babel myth. It was born at the intersection between the real history of an empire and the way its power was interpreted by its rivals. At the center of this dispute lies a city, Babylon, celebrated by some as the origin of civilization and portrayed by others as the origin of confusion. This tension between greatness and ruin, order and dispersion, sets the stage for the next parts, in which archaeological evidence and modern linguistic studies reinterpret this ancient narrative from new perspectives.
At the heart of ancient Babylon, within a vast religious complex dedicated to the god Marduk, stood the tower known as Etemenanki, whose name in Sumerian means house at the foundation of heaven and earth. This monumental structure is identified by many scholars as the historical construction that gave rise to the myth of the Tower of Babel. Located beside the Asa temple, the tower was the city's main ziggurat, built in multiple stepped levels and faced with fired bricks. Although complete descriptions of Etemenanki have been lost over time, fragments of ancient texts and archaeological findings allow historians to reconstruct, with reasonable accuracy, its scale and significance. According to records preserved on cuneiform tablets, especially those known as the Prism of Uruk and writings attributed to the Babylonian priest Berosus, the tower may have reached a height of approximately 90 meters, divided into 7 levels. Each level likely served a specific purpose, combining religious, symbolic, and possibly astronomical functions. Its square base is also believed to have measured roughly 90 meters on each side, making it one of the largest structures of the ancient world. Although the remains of the tower were heavily damaged by invasions, looting, and natural deterioration over the centuries, its foundational base was identified during excavations in the 19th century near present-day Hilla in Iraq. The most significant reconstruction of Etemenanki took place during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled Babylon between 605 and 562 BCE. Considered the greatest monarch of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, Nebuchadnezzar invested heavily in restoring the city and its religious monuments, especially those associated with the worship of Marduk.
In inscriptions left by the king himself, he states that he rebuilt the tower with baked bricks and bitumen, increasing its height and strengthening its foundations. These works were part of a broader effort to glorify Babylon as the spiritual and political capital of the empire. By restoring Etemenanki, Nebuchadnezzar reinforced the connection between his reign and the cosmic order embodied by Marduk. The tower's importance was such that it featured prominently in religious festivals, particularly the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year celebration. During this event, the statue of Marduk was carried in procession from the Asagila temple to the top of Etemenanki. This ritual symbolized the renewal of a covenant between the gods and the city, and was accompanied by public ceremonies, offerings, and acts of royal submission to the deity. In this way, the tower was not merely an imposing structure, it played a central role in the religious, cultural, and political life of Mesopotamian civilization. Its symbolic elevation also represented the spiritual elevation of a city, reinforcing its status as the center of a known world. Although many aspects of Etemenanki remain uncertain, there is broad consensus among archaeologists and historians that it directly influenced the formulation of the Tower of Babel myth. The association between a tower in structure, a powerful city, and sacred language appears repeatedly in both Mesopotamian traditions and the biblical narrative. The visual and symbolic impact of Etemenanki, visible from nearly any point in Babylon, would have impressed travelers, merchants, and even Hebrew exiles who lived in the city during the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century BCE. These groups may have transmitted, through oral tradition, a reinterpreted version of the tower across generations. The figure of Nebuchadnezzar II also appears in the Bible, particularly in the book of Daniel, where he is portrayed in an ambiguous manner, sometimes as an instrument of divine judgment, sometimes as a symbol of earthly power and arrogance. The association of his name with a towering structure in an idolatrous city may have contributed to the symbolic transformation of Etemenanki into the Tower of Babel narrative. By combining the monumentality of a structure with the theme of linguistic confusion, the biblical text constructs a powerful critique of human centralization of power, contrasting it with an ideal of dispersion and plurality found within Hebrew tradition. The history of Etemenanki, however, does not end with Nebuchadnezzar. The tower was damaged and restored multiple times over subsequent centuries, until it was ultimately destroyed following the Persian conquest and the decline of the Babylonian Empire. Today, what remains of its structure are silent ruins and archaeological traces that continue to be studied. Even so, its image endures, fueling debates about the origin of languages, the limits of human power, and the lasting echoes of ancient civilizations. From this historical and archaeological foundation emerges the path toward a more deeper analysis of what the myth sought to explain, the multiplicity of human languages.
In the great cities of Mesopotamia, the construction of temples and ziggurats was not simply an architectural initiative or a display of royal power. These projects directly involved the priestly elite who held immense influence over all aspects of urban, spiritual, and political life. Priests not only managed the temples, but were also the guardians of knowledge, astronomy, writing, and sacred rituals. In Babylon, temples functioned as religious and intellectual centers, and the ziggurats, such as the Etemenanki, were conceived within a symbolic framework that united heaven and earth. The construction of these structures followed ceremonial calendars, astrological orientations, and religious prescriptions that required the constant involvement of the clergy. The role of the priests began even before construction. They were responsible for interpreting divine signs, determining auspicious times to begin building, and choosing the exact site for the temple or ziggurat. This decision was not based solely on technical criteria, but followed a deeply religious worldview, in which sacred space had to be aligned with the celestial order. The orientation of buildings towards celestial bodies in the seasons of the year was part of this system. Moreover, priests performed rituals to purify the ground, offered sacrifices, and invoked divine protection over the work. Each brick laid was not just a physical effort, but also a liturgical act. During the building process, the priests continued to play a central role. They oversaw daily rituals, organized blessing ceremonies for the laborers, and ensured the spiritual cohesion of the project. The work did not belong solely to masons and architects. It was the city's collective effort, with priests mediating between the builders and the divine plan. It was also common for religious texts to be inscribed on bricks, columns, or foundations, reinforcing the sacred nature of the structure. These inscriptions, often in cuneiform, invoked the gods, recorded the name of the patron king, and placed curses upon anyone who might defile the temple in the future. The sacred, the political, and the administrative were inextricably intertwined. Another relevant aspect is that priests also managed the resources allocated to construction. Temples accumulated wealth, received tributes, owned land, and employed hundreds of workers. The priestly caste was therefore a significant economic force, capable of financing monumental works like ziggurats, palace complexes, and major worship centers. Through this system, cities like Babylon, and Nippur developed into highly organized urban hubs. Religious structures weren't isolated from daily life. They structured the city itself. The tower thus became both the spiritual and geographic axis of urban existence. The religious function of the structures was also reflected in the ceremonies held inside and atop them. In many ziggurats, it was believed that the gods descended to the tower's summit to receive offerings and commune with the priests. This belief made the ziggurat a kind of staircase between the human world and the divine, an idea behind the symbolism of the Tower of Babel, which the biblical narrative says had its top reaching the heavens. This was not a literal attempt to touch the sky, but a spiritual connection between realms. The priests, as intermediaries, occupied the sacred space between these two worlds, ensuring the maintenance of cosmic order. Priestly presence also influenced how knowledge was transmitted across generations. Temples served as centers of education and memory preservation. They housed clay tablets inscribed with myths, hymns, laws, and administrative records. It was within these environments that the cultural and religious traditions of Mesopotamian civilization were maintained. The construction of a tower like Etemenanki was not an isolated event, but part of a broader process of continuity and renewal of collective identity. Priests didn't just worship, they shaped how the city understood its place within the cosmos. Therefore, when analyzing the role of priests in the construction of major Mesopotamian monuments, particularly temple towers, it becomes clear that the Tower of Babel, viewed through the lens of archaeology and history, must be understood as a natural extension of this model. Religion's involvement in organizing the city and monumental construction was essential to how society functioned. The tower was not born of whim, but of a religious order that structured time, space, and power. In the next section, this social and symbolic framework will be complemented by exploring the role of ziggurats as spaces of spiritual union and public function.
The ziggurats of Mesopotamia were not limited to places of worship. They played a central social role in the urban fabric of the cities in which they stood. As towering structures visible from great distances, they served as both geographic and spiritual landmarks. Their placement, typically at the center of the city or in strategic locations, indicated that they were not just religious buildings, but true hubs around which urban life was organized.
In addition to symbolizing the connection between heaven and earth, they also represented political stability and the permanence of religious authority. The city, its streets, markets, and walls grew around the ziggurat like a living organism, structured around a sacred core. These structures also concentrated economic and administrative activity. The temple complexes attached to ziggurats housed storage rooms, granaries, archives, and scribe chambers. They functioned as centers for collecting and redistributing tributes, grain, and artisanal goods. It was common for farmers to deliver part of their harvests to the temples, which managed these resources through meticulous records kept on cuneiform tablets. Priests, along with scribes and administrators, oversaw these operations, giving ziggurats an active role in the city's management. Thus, the temple was not detached from society. It was the heart of a complex web of economic, social, and religious relationships. The social function of ziggurats also included the mobilization of labor. Large construction, maintenance, and expansion projects involved hundreds, sometimes thousands of workers, including craftsmen, carpenters, potters, and laborers. This mobilization helped integrate local communities, often under the coordination of priestly and political authorities. The building of a ziggurat, therefore, was not just an act of devotion, but a collective endeavor that reinforced social ties, stimulated the economy, and consolidated the authority of urban elites. These efforts also gave rise to festivals and public rituals, strengthening the population's cohesion through shared celebrations and experiences. Symbolically, the tiered shape of the ziggurats was rich in meaning. Each level of the structure represented a gradual approach to the divine realm, creating a vertical hierarchy that reflected cosmic and social order. The higher the level, the closer to the sacred, and only the highest-ranking priests, and in some cases the king, could ascend to the uppermost levels. This separation between high and low was mirrored in class relations, with the elite closer to the divine and workers operating at the base, both literally and symbolically. The architecture of the ziggurats, therefore, was not neutral. It communicated power, legitimacy, and a worldview that structured both religion and politics. Additionally, ziggurats fulfilled educational and cultural functions. In their surrounding areas were libraries and temple schools where apprentices trained to become scribes, priests, or administrators. These institutions formed the city's intellectual elite, preserving and transmitting technical and religious knowledge across generations. Cuneiform writing, offering rituals, sacred calendars, and even treatises on medicine and mathematics circulated in this environment, showing that ziggurats were also centers for the production and preservation of knowledge. Their role as guardians of collective memory made them even more central to the urban landscape. From an urban planning perspective, ziggurats also influenced the physical layout of cities. Main roads often extended outward from the temple toward the city gates, facilitating the movement of people and goods. The tower's elevated position allowed for the observation of large areas, sometimes functioning as a watchtower or signaling point. During religious festivals, crowds gathered around these structures, fostering cultural and commercial exchanges between regions. This solidified the ziggurat's role as a gathering place for communities, a symbol of collective identity, and a focal point of political centralization. The social function of ziggurats, therefore, went far beyond worship. They were hubs that integrated religion, administration, economy, culture, and urban planning. They represented at once the link with the gods and the material foundation of human power. When viewed through this lens, the Tower of Babel no longer is simply a symbol of pride. It becomes part of an urban model deeply embedded in the logic of ancient civilizations. In the next section, this understanding will be expanded through the lens of modern linguistics, which will analyze the myth of the confusion of languages from a scientific rather than symbolic perspective.
Modern linguistic studies have brought to light a series of discoveries that challenge the simplicity of a biblical narrative about the origin of languages. While Genesis presents linguistic diversity as a divine punishment resulting from the construction of the Tower of Babel, linguists have investigated the evolution of languages through phonetic, morphological, and grammatical comparisons across different idioms. This scientific approach suggests that human languages evolved gradually over millennia in parallel and often independent processes. Indo-European languages, for example, reveal a shared ancestry dating back thousands of years before any written record, showing that the similarities among modern languages are not accidental, but the result of a common linguistic heritage. Historical linguistics allows us to trace the path of languages from a common root, such as Proto-Indo-European, and understand how this ancestral language branched into various modern tongues like Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and later Portuguese, Spanish, and French. These studies reveal that far from a sudden explosion of diversity, languages transformed through migrations, cultural contacts, and internal developments. Even completely distinct languages, such as Chinese and Arabic, may share elements due to indirect influences or cultural borrowings. This kind of analysis dismantles the idea that languages emerged from an abrupt divine act, reinforcing a human, complex, and gradual origin of language. However, the idea of an original language still intrigues many scholars. Some believe that all languages may have emerged from a single ancestral idiom that diversified over time. This hypothesis of a universal proto-language is the subject of intense debate. Researchers attempt to identify common patterns among seemingly unrelated languages, seeking phonetic roots and grammatical structures that might point to this common origin. However, the farther back in time one goes, the scarcity of available evidence becomes. The lack of sufficiently ancient written records makes any definitive conclusion difficult, and the hypothesis remains in the realm of academic speculation. The Tower of Babel narrative, in this context, represents a powerful metaphor for explaining a world's linguistic confusion. From a symbolic perspective, the story is a response to the human experience of fragmentation and miscommunication. In a world where languages hinder mutual understanding, the idea of an original rupture makes emotional and psychological sense. The biblical story, therefore, more than a literal historical account, can be read as an attempt to make sense of the fact that humans, though belonging to the same species, speak in such different ways. It provides a mythical explanation for an observable reality, while science offers more complex models based on empirical evidence. The role of archaeology in this debate is also important, though limited. Cuneiform inscriptions, hieroglyphs, and other ancient writing systems help map the development of written language, but do not reveal how speech sounded in much earlier times. Writing emerged long after spoken language and only records a small portion of a civilization's linguistic reality. Even so, the study of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian tablets demonstrates the sophistication and variety of Mesopotamian language systems, reinforcing the idea that linguistic diversity was not a post-Babel phenomenon, but already existed before the earliest scripts. Moreover, the analysis of language as a biological phenomenon also contributes to the debate. Studies in neuroscience and genetics suggest that linguistic capacity is deeply rooted in the human brain. The FOP2 gene, for instance, has been identified as important for the development of speech, and its presence in both humans and Neanderthals indicates that language may have evolved well before modern Homo sapiens. This perspective reinforces the idea that the emergence of language did not depend on a single event, but was the result of accumulated evolutionary pressures that shaped the human brain for complex communication. Finally, even with all the sophistication of modern linguistics, the exact origin of languages remains one of humanity's great mysteries.
The Tower of Babel myth, with its engaging and symbolic narrative, remains a powerful reminder of our search for meaning amid the chaos of communication. Although scientific explanations offer more plausible models for the origin of languages, they do not replace the fascination provoked by ancient myths. Both paths, science and tradition, contribute in different ways to our understanding of the complexity of language and its importance in human history.
The linguistic diversity we see in today's world did not arise in a chaotic or instantaneous way, as the biblical story of the Tower of Babel might suggest. Instead, historical linguistics shows that human languages evolved gradually from common roots known as proto-languages. When human groups migrated or became geographically isolated, their speech patterns changed independently, eventually creating dialects and then distinct languages. Over centuries, this process formed language families, groups of related languages that share grammatical structures, core vocabulary, and similar phonetic patterns. The largest known family is the Indo-European, which includes languages ranging from Portuguese and Spanish to Russian, Persian, and Hindi. All of these are believed to have evolved from a common ancestral tongue known as Proto-Indo-European, spoken roughly 6,000 years ago. Linguists reconstruct this language through systematic comparisons between modern and ancient tongues, such as Sanskrit, ancient Greek, and Latin. The similarity in words like mother, mata, madre, mother, mat, and three, trace, tree, trea, across these languages points to a deep-rooted connection. Beyond Indo-European, there are many other important families. The Sino-Tibetan family includes Mandarin and Burmese. The Afro-Asiatic family encompasses Arabic, Hebrew, and Amharic. The Niger-Congo family, predominant in sub-Saharan Africa, is one of the largest in terms of number of spoken languages. There is also the Uralic family, including Finnish, Hungarian, and Estonian. Each of these families carries a millennia-old story of dispersion, migration, and cultural adaptation, revealing much about the peoples who spoke them and the paths they took. On the other hand, some languages are true mysteries, as they do not belong to any known family. The most famous example is Basque, spoken in northern Spain and southwestern France, which shows no demonstrable link to any other living or extinct language. Another intriguing case is Ainu, spoken by a small group in Japan. These isolated languages might be remnants of entire language families that vanished without leaving records, highlighting how much linguistic heritage has already been lost throughout history. Linguistics has also proposed macro-family theories, attempting to link various known families under a more ancient common origin. The Nostratic hypothesis, for example, suggests a shared ancestry between Indo-European, Uralic, Altaic, and Afro-Asiatic languages. Another idea is the Dene-Caucasian hypothesis, which would unite languages from the Caucasus, Northern Asia, and even North America. These proposals are controversial and highly speculative, since they reach so far back in time that reliable evidence becomes extremely limited and hard to interpret. The study of language families also reveals patterns of contact and cultural exchange. When two populations interact for long enough, even if they belong to different families, their languages may influence each other. This results in phenomena like loanwords, mixed languages, and creoles. In some cases, such as the Roman Empire or European colonialism, a dominant language replaces others, erasing traces of ancient families. Thus, language evolution is not just biological or geographic, it is also political, economic, and cultural. In this light, the idea that linguistic diversity came from a divine punishment loses ground to historical evidence. Rather than a sudden event of confusion, what we see is a long trajectory of transformation, branching, and adaptation.
Language families not only demonstrate human ingenuity in communication, but also serve as living records of ancient migrations, civilizations, and cultural interactions. They help tell the true story behind our linguistic multiplicity, a story that, unlike the myth, is slow, rich, and deeply human.
The literal reading in a Tower of Babel story dominated Western imagination for many centuries. The biblical narrative, with its simple and powerful language, suggested that the diversity of languages arose as divine punishment for human arrogance. This version was long treated as an unquestionable historical fact, especially in societies influenced by Christianity. However, from the 19th century onward, with the advancement of fields such as archaeology, philology, and anthropology, the literal view began to collapse under the weight of accumulated scientific evidence. Even the notion of a single universal original language lost strength in the face of the complexity observed in historical records. With the rise of textual criticism and comparative studies of ancient Near Eastern traditions, scholars realized that the biblical account shared symbolic elements with myths from Sumer, Babylon, and other Mesopotamian cultures. The idea of a tower linking heaven and earth, for instance, already existed in ziggurats like Etemenanki, predating the writing of Genesis. This revealed that the text did not emerge in a vacuum, but rather dialogued with the religious and cosmological ideas at a time. From this point, many began to see the story of Babel as a parable about human pride and the limitations of civilization, not as a journalistic record of a real event. Historical linguistics also contributed to dismantling the literal reading. No serious study of languages or ancient records supports the thesis that all languages came from one that was suddenly broken apart. On the contrary, what we observe is a progressive and gradual multiplication of languages over millennia through natural processes such as migration, geographic isolation, hybridization, and cultural shifts. The idea of a sudden confusion of languages proves implausible when compared with the evolutionary logic of language, documented in manuscripts, inscriptions, and linguistic patterns. Furthermore, the structure of the biblical text itself shows signs of symbolic intention. The Babel story serves as a narrative bridge between the flood and the calling of Abraham, two key events in Genesis. Its function seems less about explaining the origin of languages and more about marking the end of a unified humanity and the beginning of Israel's specific history. This literary reading is reinforced by internal parallels in the Bible itself, which often uses metaphorical language and theological narrative structure to convey moral and existential messages. Another factor that contributed to the rejection of literalism was archaeology. Excavations in cities like Babylon, Nippur, and Eridu revealed the existence of cultural and linguistic plurality in Mesopotamia long before the supposed time of the Tower of Babel. Cuneiform documents showed that various languages coexisted in that region for millennia, making the idea that they were all created suddenly from one untenable. This documented historical plurality reinforces the view that the biblical narrative plays a theological role, not a descriptive one. In contemporary theology, even among many practicing Christians and Jews, there's growing acceptance that the early chapters of Genesis, including the Tower of Babel, are symbolic accounts composed to explain the human condition rather than record precise chronological events. Faith in this context no longer depends on literalness, but on the spiritual and ethical meaning of the stories. Thus, the Tower of Babel comes to be interpreted as a call for humility, recognition of human limitations, and appreciation of cultural diversity, not as a lesson in linguistic obedience. Therefore, the fall of the literal reading of a biblical story does not represent a weakening of the text, but rather a rediscovery of its depth.
By understanding Babel as myth, allegory, or metaphor, we gain the chance to engage with its broader meanings about language, identity, community, and power. Science does not destroy the Bible. It merely removes it from the pedestal of rigid factuality and repositions it in the more fertile field of symbolic interpretation. And it is in this realm that its message can continue to resonate, even in a plural, scientific world increasingly aware of its own historical complexity.
The story of the Tower of Babel does not end on the pages of Genesis. Far beyond the biblical text, it has been reinterpreted by cultures, empires, and generations over the centuries. The image of the tower that tries to reach the heavens came to symbolize, in different contexts, human ambition, arrogance, or even the pursuit of unity. Still in antiquity, Jewish and Christian authors revisited the story to illustrate moral lessons about pride and punishment. Greek and Roman philosophers were also interested in this myth, not for its theological content, but for its metaphor of a world divided by languages. The myth of the tower thus gained rare malleability. It did not need to be literally believed in to exert symbolic power. During the Middle Ages, the Tower of Babel became one of the most popular themes in European sacred art. Frescoes, stained glass, sculptures, and illuminated manuscripts depicted the tower as an unfinished construction, often in the form of a ziggurat, reflecting a fusion of biblical and Mesopotamian references. At the same time, theologians saw the tower as a representation of human failure and the need for redemption. In a world where religion guided the understanding of past and present, the myth of Babel was a powerful visual reminder of human limitation before divine will. The theme even appeared in linguistic treatises, trying to justify the origin and diversity of languages as a consequence of an ancestral sin. With the Renaissance and the rediscovery of classical antiquity, the myth was reinterpreted once again. Artists like Peter Bruegel the Elder created iconic depictions of the Tower of Babel, giving it monumental traits filled with architectural realism and political allegories. In times of nation-building and urban growth, the tower came to symbolize the conflict between unity and diversity, between ambition and fragmentation. Many saw it as a parallel to modern empires trying to impose languages and cultures on different peoples. The tower ceased to be merely a religious warning and became a political symbol of the glory and downfall of large collective projects. In the 19th century, with the rise of linguistics and archaeology, the myth of the Tower of Babel was explored from a new angle. Scholars focused on the multiplicity of human languages and ancient Middle Eastern records, seeking common origins. The narrative of the tower was used as a metaphor for the effort to decipher extinct languages and reconstruct the history of human communication. Meanwhile, amid the social transformations of modernity, the idea of Babel resurfaced as a symbol at a collapse of communication, especially in urban and industrial contexts, where information overload and lack of understanding seemed to recreate the original linguistic chaos of the myth. In the 20th century, with the world wars and the emergence of globalization, the image of the Tower of Babel acquired new layers of meaning. It was evoked as a metaphor for misunderstanding among nations, the failure of modern utopias, and the crisis of language in the information age. At the same time, it was explored by literature and cinema as a mythological structure adapted to contemporary fears. Authors like Jorge Luis Borges and Franz Kafka used Babel to question the limits of knowledge, communication, and reality itself. The tower became more than ever an archetypal image, profoundly ambiguous and endlessly reusable.
Today, the myth remains alive in pop culture and philosophical discussions. It appears in films, TV shows, music, video games, and political speeches. In dystopian fiction, Babel often symbolizes both information confusion and the collapse of large systems. In visual language, it is used as a representation of excess, the failure of unity, or nostalgia for an era of common understanding. The term Babel has become synonymous with linguistic chaos, especially in digital and globalized environments. At the same time, the concept inspires debates on artificial intelligence, universal language, and communication ethics, showing that even millennia later, the tower's symbol still speaks to human dilemmas. This symbolic longevity at the Tower of Babel is due to its archetypal malleability. Unlike fixed myths, it survives through constant adaptation. It can represent ambition, ruin, diversity, confusion, or hope, depending on the historical context. It appears in theological debates, linguistic theories, artistic constructions, and political metaphors. In each era, the tower is rebuilt, not with bricks, but with meanings. It's a clear example of how an ancient myth can cross centuries and continue to offer new interpretations, functioning as a mirror of our own contradictions and desires. And as long as there are questions about language, power, and identity, the tower will remain standing, at least in our imagination.
The story of the Tower of Babel has transcended the boundaries of religion and established itself as a powerful cultural symbol over the centuries. Its presence is remarkable across various artistic and literary expressions, constantly reinterpreted according to the context of each era. This symbolic malleability allowed the tower to become more than just a biblical element. It turned into a universal metaphor about the challenges of communication, the boundless ambition of humankind, and the emergence of chaos from linguistic disorder. For this reason, it continues to be revisited by artists, writers, and thinkers even millennia after its first appearance in sacred texts. In Renaissance painting, the Tower of Babel gained one of its most iconic representations through the works of Peter Bruegel the Elder. In his most famous painting from 1563, Bruegel depicted the tower as a colossal construction with traits inspired by Roman architecture, especially the Colosseum. The image conveys a sense of grandeur and disorganization at once, a magnificent structure doomed to collapse. His choice to portray the tower as unfinished and unstable visualizes the divine punishment narrated in the Bible, and this version became the most influential in Western imagination. From it, dozens of other visual depictions were inspired, perpetuating Bruegel's aesthetic for centuries. In literature, the myth flourished with great intensity, particularly from the 20th century onward. Authors like Franz Kafka, Jorge Luis Borges, and Thomas Pynchon used the Tower of Babel as a metaphor for themes such as the failure of language, the fragmentation of knowledge, and the absurdity of human existence. Borges, for instance, in his story The Library of Babel, created a universe where the quest for absolute knowledge leads to confusion and disorientation. Kafka explored the feeling of alienation and helplessness in the face of incomprehensible systems, echoing the communicative collapse of Babel. In all these cases, the tower is no longer a physical structure, but becomes a symbol of the human condition. Philosophy and linguistics also incorporated the Babel myth into their reflections on language and meaning. Philosophers like Jacques Derrida used the image of Babel to question the idea of a perfect, universal language, arguing that all communication is, by nature, subject to noise, interpretation, and failure. In this context, Babel symbolizes the diversity of languages as an essential feature of the human condition, not as punishment, but as creative potential. Instead of lamenting linguistic confusion, contemporary authors celebrate multiplicity as a source of cultural and interpretive richness, portraying the tower as a symbol of plurality rather than downfall.
In contemporary art, Babel continues to reinterpret through various mediums. Artistic installations, sculptures, and digital works explore the image of the tower to critique globalization, information overload, and the difficulty of communication in the modern world. In many of these works, the tower is built from everyday objects, overlapping words, computer screens, and stacked books, suggesting that we live in a new Babylonian age where the excess of language and information generates a different kind of misunderstanding. The tower, in these cases, becomes a mirror of our time, reflecting the organized chaos of technological and media-driven modernity. In cinema, the myth found notable expression in the film Babel, 2006, directed by Alejandro González Iñárritu. The movie follows simultaneous stories in different parts of the world, connected by a common thematic thread: the difficulty of human communication. The choice of the title Babel is not just symbolic, but structural to the narrative, which unfolds through multiple languages, cultures, and perspectives. The lack of understanding among the characters lead to tragedies, conflict, and isolation, powerfully illustrating the impact of failed dialogue. The film reinforces the myth's relevance, showing that even without physical towers, we still live under Babel's shadow. The Tower of Babel also frequently appears in pop culture. Music videos, songs, comic books, video games, and even advertising campaigns. Futuristic skyscrapers are nicknamed New Babels, while videos and slogans explore message confusion as a central theme. In some contexts, Babel is used to criticize intellectual elitism or technological arrogance, as if we're always trying to reach the heavens by artificial means. In others, it symbolizes the multicultural richness of a globalized world. This ambivalence shows how the myth remains relevant, speaking directly to the anxieties and hopes of contemporary society, where both the dream of unity and the risk of communicative collapse coexist.
Throughout history, the narrative of the Tower of Babel was frequently appropriated for political purposes, serving as a symbolic justification for projects of cultural domination, linguistic unification, and social exclusion. From ancient times onward, rulers and authorities invoked the image of the tower's collapse as an example of what happens when division, disobedience, or an excess of voices emerges. The idea that linguistic multiplicity leads to confusion and hinders progress became the foundation for policies aimed at suppressing diversity in favor of standardization. The original metaphor was reinterpreted not as a warning against excess, but as an argument for centralization and control. During a Roman Empire, for instance, the imposition of Latin as the official language was not merely an administrative decision, but a political strategy. Linguistic diversity among conquered peoples was seen as a threat to order and imperial unity. By promoting Latin as the language of law, religion, and culture, Rome transformed language into a powerful instrument of assimilation. In this context, the logic behind the Tower of Babel narrative was implicit. If linguistic division caused collapse, linguistic unity could sustain an empire. This reasoning would reappear in different forms throughout subsequent centuries. In the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church exercised strict control over language by restricting biblical texts to Latin and prohibiting translations into vernacular languages. While the justification was theological, the effects were deeply political. By limiting access to sacred texts to a literate elite, the Church preserved its monopoly over interpretation and spiritual authority. Attempts to translate or reinterpret Scripture were perceived as threats to unity and order. Linguistic plurality was associated with disorder and fragmentation, echoing the fear of a new Babel emerging through divergent interpretations. In the nation-states in the modern era, language once again became central to political identity. Governments promoted official national languages while suppressing regional, minority, or indigenous tongues through education systems and legal frameworks.
The stated goal was cohesion and progress, but the underlying logic echoed the Babel narrative. Diversity was portrayed as chaos, while linguistic uniformity was framed as stability. Language policy thus became a mechanism to shape collective identity and align populations with centralized authority. In the 20th century, totalitarian regimes intensified this relationship between language and power. In Nazi Germany, linguistic purity was closely associated with racial ideology, and foreign terms were systematically eliminated or replaced. In the Soviet Union, although linguistic diversity was officially recognized, Russian was promoted as the language of unity, modernization, and political loyalty. In both systems, controlling language meant controlling discourse and limiting dissent. The fragmented Tower of Babel symbolized precisely what these regimes sought to prevent: plurality beyond centralized control. At the same time, attempts to overcome linguistic fragmentation also carried political implications. The creation of Esperanto in the late 19th century aimed to establish a neutral international language that could reduce misunderstandings between nations. Its proponents viewed Babel as a problem that could finally be solved through rational design. However, governments often resisted the project, fearing it could weaken national identities or support internationalist movements. Even efforts framed as solutions to Babel became entangled in political concerns over authority and control. In the contemporary world, globalization and digital communication have revived these debates in new forms. The Internet enables unprecedented interaction between languages and cultures, creating what many describe as a modern Babel. At the same time, governments and corporations seek to regulate platforms, standardize terminology, and control the flow of information. The ancient narrative continues to resonate, not as a distant myth, but as a framework through which power, language, and communication are negotiated. The Tower of Babel remains a reference point in discussions about who speaks, how communication is organized, and who ultimately holds authority over meaning.
As the narrative of the Tower of Babel spread among different civilizations, its symbolism was gradually reinterpreted, shifting from divine punishment to a landmark of cultural differentiation. Rather than representing solely the fall caused by human arrogance, the tower came to be seen as a foundational moment in which peoples gained their own voices. This interpretive shift transformed linguistic confusion from a curse into a legacy. The diversity of languages, customs, and worldviews began to be celebrated by many as a sign of unique identity. Various ethnic and linguistic groups reinterpreted the myth to highlight their own traditions, using the image of the tower in contrast to the cultural standardization imposed by empires or globalization. For communities subjected to colonization, for example, the story of Babel served as a symbolic justification for preserving their native languages, cosmologies, and rituals. The myth began to offer a narrative framework for the idea that every people has a legitimate and authentic way of communicating with the world, one that deserves to be preserved despite external pressures. In Jewish diaspora traditions especially, the linguistic diversity inherited from Babel was understood not as a curse, but as part of the mission to live among nations while maintaining one's own identity. Hebrew, which had long been reserved for liturgical use, coexisted with local languages such as Yiddish, Ladino, and many others, and this multiplicity became integrated into the historical experience of the Jewish people. The tower symbolized, in this context, the point at which humanity learned to coexist in difference, even at the expense of unity.
In modern literature, especially after the 18th and 19th centuries, the Tower of Babel began to be explored as a symbol of the fragmented human condition, but also as a symbol of resistance. Nationalist writers and advocates of cultural self-determination invoked the tower to express the importance of keeping cultural roots alive amid waves of domination or assimilation. The myth was used to reinforce the idea that the separation between peoples, far from being a mistake, was a necessary condition for freedom of expression, artistic creation, and the flourishing of different forms of wisdom. Conversely, the architectural image of the tower itself became an ambiguous symbol. For some, it represented a futile attempt at unification, a tower that tried to reach the heavens and was destroyed. For others, its ruin marked the birth of multiple identities. In artworks, poems, and paintings, the tower was no longer depicted solely in collapse, but in ongoing construction, each people building its own tower, its own language, its own worldview. Thus, the symbol that once represented a single project came to represent thousands of parallel ones. This perspective also gained traction in contemporary philosophical and linguistic debates. Thinkers such as Walter Benjamin and Jacques Derrida saw in the Tower of Babel a metaphor of the inevitable incompleteness of human language, a foundational division that prevents any system of meaning from being total. For these authors, the plurality generated at Babel is not an accident to be corrected, but the very essence of human communication. In this sense, linguistic diversity is not a barrier, but an irreplaceable richness that challenges all projects of cultural unification. The Tower of Babel, therefore, crystallized throughout history, not only as a mythical tale or divine warning, but as a mirror of the human condition itself, marked by difference, by multiplicity, and by the constant desire to assert oneself in relation to the other. It became a symbol of identity pride and a symbolic boundary between cultures that recognized themselves as distinct but coexisting. This reinterpretation of the tower remains relevant in an increasingly globalized world, where the tension between identity and standardization still persists as a central theme in cultural debates.
Throughout this script, the Tower of Babel was presented not as an isolated element of a religious text, but as a narrative that spans millennia, connecting myth, history, archaeology, and language. By examining the contexts of Mesopotamia, real ziggurats, historical Babylon, and ancient records, it became clear that the biblical story directly dialogues with a concrete world, marked by grand constructions, powerful cities, and a deep relationship between humans and the divine. The Tower of Babel thus emerges as a meeting point between symbolic tradition and historical reality. Archaeological analysis showed that structures such as the Etemenanki were not literary fantasies, but real buildings that occupied the center of religious and political life in Mesopotamian cities. These towers were not meant physically to reach the heavens, but symbolized the connection between gods and men. When the biblical text speaks of reaching the heavens, it uses language common to that time, loaded with symbolic meaning. This allows us to understand that the narrative is not describing an architectural absurdity, but rather translating a worldview of the ancient civilizations. At the same time, the biblical story of the Tower of Babel connects to a wide set of myths from the ancient Near East, such as the tales of Gilgamesh, Adapa, and other Mesopotamian traditions. These myths share recurring themes, such as the transgression of limits, the human desire for permanence, and the tension between divine order and human ambition. The Tower of Babel thus emerges as a meeting point between symbolic tradition and historical reality.
At the same time, modern linguistics help dismantle the literal reading of the origin of languages, showing that they emerge through gradual processes over thousands of years. Language families, phonetic transformations, and cultural evolutions demonstrate that linguistic diversity is a continuous historical phenomenon, not a sudden event. Even so, the myth of the Tower of Babel remained relevant because it offers a symbolic explanation for a real fact, the multiplicity of human languages and cultures. The power of the narrative is also explained by how it has been reinterpreted over time. In art, literature, and politics, the Tower of Babel has taken on varied meanings, being used both as a warning and as a metaphor for cultural identity. It has been associated with power, separation, communication, and diversity, adapting to the concerns of each era. This capacity for reinterpretation kept the myth alive, even in the face of scientific and historical advances. Therefore, the Tower of Babel cannot be understood solely as myth or solely as history. It occupies an intermediate space where historical facts, religious symbols, and cultural interpretations intertwine. Its value does not lie in proving whether the tower existed exactly as described, but in revealing how ancient peoples explained the world, organized knowledge, and dealt with human diversity. The tower thus becomes a key to understanding past mentalities and their continuities in the present. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell to receive more videos like this.